I think the most important thing in redistricting in North Carolina as it relates to the state legislative races, and that's all this relates to. There are an entirely different set of rules for congressional races, for county commission districting. The only set of districts that we're talking about today is the state senate and the state house district, and they have some very special and specific rules that impact how they're drawn. And they spring out of a early 2000s court case called Stevenson versus Bartlett. It was brought by a guy named Ashley Stevenson, who was a great conservative activist from Beaufort County. And he, in the early 2000s, instigated some litigation against the Democratic majority in the State House and the State Senate and the maps that they drew. And the basis of that litigation was the whole county provision of the North Carolina Constitution. And for those of you that don't know, the North Carolina Constitution says that no county shall be divided in the creation of a representative or senatorial district in North Carolina. And because of some federal litigation in the late 70s and early 80s, a lot of people thought that that piece of our Constitution was a dead letter or was no longer applicable and didn't function. So you had, starting in the 80s, the Democrats who controlled the state and the redistricting process at this time began to split counties. And that had never been done before because the constitutional provision was operative prior to the 80s. And so you began to get these, what we commonly refer to today as gerrymanders, where you would get counties split in odd shapes and kind of bizarre looking districts. And I think the most famous one is probably a congressional district in North Carolina, the 12th congressional district, which was litigated ad nauseum for 30 years before it went away in the last decade. But Ashley Stevenson decided to pursue some litigation after the Democrats came out with maps in 2001 that divided about 2/3 of the state's the state's counties informing the House district map, and over half of the counties informing the Senate district map. And he sued in state court and basically asked the court to enforce the whole county provision. And ultimately, he prevailed. And what that's actually done is created in North Carolina a baseline map that either Republicans or Democrats must use that is optimal and complies with the court's rulings. And we refer to those criteria today kind of as the Stevenson criteria. It's the set of requirements that came out of Ashley Stevenson's litigation, and that kind of formed the baseline of our district construction for State House and State Senate. And I think a good way to think about it is a lot of times you see these shell office buildings, and they're framed up, and there's a you get the frame, and then you have people come in and kind of fill out the inside of the building in different shapes and the way they want. But the frame is the same regardless of who comes in and fills out the interior of the building. And I think that's a good way to think about how this works. So the courts adopted this criteria, and some Duke University professors who have worked for the Democratic Party and the Democratic plaintiffs in the litigation. I mean, shockingly, the professors and the academics are liberals and partisan Democrats. I know that'll come as shock to all your viewers, Mitch, but that's the case. But they created an algorithm a few years back that kind of helped, if you dumped your North Carolina census data into this algorithm, and produce the optimal map, or in some cases, a series of equally optimal maps where legislators have choices about which configuration to pick based on other criteria. So we got that algorithm, and we dumped all the new census data in, and it coughed out the what are known as the baseline kind of county grouping maps that exist to comply with the Stevenson decision. The best way to describe in a short way the outcome of this is because we now have, we can't do but a 5% variance on population across the district. So every county can't be whole in this process. But What the court said is you have to keep as many counties whole as possible functionally, and limit the number of time counties are split. And so the way that these counties are grouped together now basically is you put counties together to make whole county groups, and then in the bigger urban areas where there's million plus people now in Mecklenburg and Wake County, the county tends to have multiple districts within it and is divided to accommodate those districts. There's an absolute finite number, and this algorithm that the Duke professors came up with allows spits out mathematically the choice that best complies with these criteria. And I think in the state house map, there are two or three places where you have some choices about how you put together a group of 4 or 5 counties. You could put them together so that they go together one way or the other way, and the same thing in a couple other spots. And in the Senate map, there are 4 places like that. I think there are 3 in the House map and 4 in the Senate map. But again, it's basically the same set of counties. And there are just a couple of different ways that get the same outcome from the algorithm, and the legislators will have to choose how to put them together. And the interesting thing, I think, Mitch, was when we ran the numbers on those counties, it was really interesting. It didn't really matter which way you put them together, that you kind of got the same. You would expect to get a similar partisan or political outcome from grouping them that way. So again, it kind of shows that the process that the courts had adopted really in large measure has made North Carolina's redistricting process formulaic. There aren't a lot of choices legislators get to make anymore. Something like 80% of the districts probably are determined by this formula, and the remaining 20% districts, most of them tend to be in these big urban counties. And then you have to, I think the criteria they adopted this year are going to require them basically to try and keep the districts in the same cities and keep them compact, and just some very traditional redistricting principles. So after all these years of people yelling and screaming, gerrymandering, 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 and again, I think in large measure on the left, the yelling and screaming about gerrymandering is a result of them being outcome driven. If they don't get a set of districts that favor them, they call it a gerrymander, regardless of what process is used. And one of the things that we hear a lot about in redistricting litigation that I think we ought to talk about some, Mitch, is just people say, well, North Carolina is a really evenly divided state. In statewide elections, I see over and over again the Republican wins by 2 or 3 points, or the Democrat wins by 2 or 3 points. Yet Republicans tend to have a larger share of the congressional delegation than Democrats, and Republicans tend to get a larger share of the votes than 50-50 in the legislature. And why is that? And I think there's been a lot of research on that. I mean, I bet a bunch of your viewers read Nate Silver, a liberal commentator and analyst, and runs a blog called 538. And I think he's pointed out, and it's very true in North Carolina, that the Democrats, when it comes to drawing districts, have a disadvantage in that their voters are very inefficiently crammed into a few geographic locations, while Republicans' voters tend to be spread out and dispersed more evenly across states and across the country, honestly. So you end up with counties like Orange and Durham that are pretty heavily populated, that vote 75-25 for the Democrats, and then you end up with counties like Johnson and Harnett and Gaston, and medium-sized counties that vote 60-40 for Republicans. And I think the best way to think about this is if you look at the 2016 gubernatorial election in North Carolina, which was basically a tie. It was basically evenly divided outcome between Cooper and McCrory. I think Cooper got about 9,000 or 10,000 more votes than McCrory, which is basically a tie if you think about the volume of votes cast. For McCrory to get to his half of the votes, he had to win, I think it was 66 counties, or maybe even 3/4. And then Cooper had to get about somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the counties to get to his half of the vote. And you can see there, I think that's a great example of how the Democratic voting coalition that results in really close elections in the state is compact geographically, and the Republican voting coalition, which results in about Republicans generally getting about half the vote in statewide elections, is dispersed geographically. And so when you have a whole county provision in your Constitution, and you have the difference in terms of the dispersal of the voters, it favors the party that whose voters are more efficiently dispersed. And you see the same thing in U.S. Senate elections nationally. We've got a lot of Republican states like Wyoming that send 2 Republican senators, and a lot of Democratic states like California that send 2 Democratic senators. And so, it's the same sort of principle at play in North Carolina. In the state Senate, number one, the districts are larger, so the inefficient distribution of Democratic voters doesn't hurt Democrats as much in the state Senate as it does where you have smaller districts like in the state House. So they're not as disadvantaged by the inefficient domicile decisions Democratic voters tend to make. And what it looked like to us, and we don't have any inside knowledge of how the districts will be drawn, and there's still decisions to be made, but it looked to us like Republicans have a baseline of somewhere in the mid 20 seat range, somewhere between 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, somewhere in there, and the Democrats would have somewhere between 18 and 20 pretty solid seats, and that you'd have 8 to 10 toss-up seats out there. And that's kind of the situation the parties have been in for the last decade. And in the state House, again, the smaller size of the districts, there are about 85,000 people in a House district, a perfect House district, and about 200,000 people in a perfect Senate district in North Carolina, maybe 205,000. The smaller size of a House district means that inefficient geographic dispersal, or the efficient geographic dispersal of Republican voters, advantages the House more than it does the Senate. It looked to me like the Republicans probably had a solid 60 to 62-3 seats that would be real hard for the Democrats to win, and that's enough to get a majority in and of itself. And then another 15 to 20 potentially competitive seats, and leaving the Democrats with something in the order of 40, somewhere around 40 solid seats. So I think if I was if I was to rank the probability of one of the chambers flipping from Republicans to Democrats just based on what we've seen in the optimal county grouping map, I'd say the Democrats had a marginally better chance of winning the state Senate than they do the state House. Democratic voters tend to prefer to live in urban settings with higher density, and Republican voters have tended to choose to live in suburban and rural settings where the housing is less dense, and that it's just the kind of self-sorting of the voters has led to this efficiency or inefficiency depending upon which side you're on. And you're right, it's nothing the politicians have done or could do or couldn't do, but it's also why you see a bunch of the Democratic and kind of socialist academics out there pushing for an argument that redistricting should result in proportional representation, which is kind of the pathway towards a parliamentary system like what you see in most European countries. And so, again, I'd argue that most of the academic experts, and I use the term expert, because they convey that on themselves, and their friends in the liberal media use the moniker for them, but really what they are partisans, and they're pushing for a system that will give them the outcome that favors their side. When you start seeing things like the efficiency gap and proportional representation, I mean, it flies in the face of most of the fundamental tenets that we find enshrined in the U.S. and the North Carolina Constitution. the way that the state's maps are put together now, it's, like I think described it earlier, is kind of, it's formulaic redistricting. There are some decisions that the legislators still have to make and get to make, but again, the shell of the building is created by this court-ordered Stevenson criteria, this formula, and it would make it very hard, even if the Democrats had carte blanche within the building to divide it up. It would still be very hard for them to. It would take an extreme gerrymander for them to draw a map that guaranteed them a majority. Both parties have something of a problem in that. A lot of the people in the middle in politics right now that ultimately decide statewide and really contested legislative seats think that both parties have pushed pretty far to the extreme edges of their ideological spectrum. And I think that problem is you see it in the Democratic Party, and you see it in the Republican Party. And so I don't think that the Democrats I think it is a problem. I think the philosophy of the party, of the Democratic Party, is a problem for them in terms of winning elections. But I think I think before Republicans crow too loudly about the Democrats' problems in that vein, they ought to look pretty carefully in the mirror and contemplate, whether what they say about the Democrats also applies to them. And I think there's been a belief that a lot of the growth is in these metropolitan areas, and that would result in more seats in these big urban counties, and that would benefit the Democrats in redistricting. And again, I think a lot of times what we see is that people in each party have a tendency to look only at one side of a coin. And the Democrats were right about that. Mecklenburg and Wake County are both up to 13 House seats now, so they gained seats. And in the Senate, Mecklenburg is up to 6 seats with an adjoining county, and Wake County is up to 6 seats with one adjoining county. And so the Democrats will probably, in particular in Wake County, pick up a seat and a seat in the House and potentially a seat in the Senate. But the metro growth isn't just confined to these big counties. It's happening in Johnston County. It's happening in Union County. It's happening in Cabarrus County. It's happening in Brunswick County. And these counties that abut the major urban counties also are picking up seats. Like there's a new open Senate seat in Johnston County. That seat's going to be a Republican seat. So I think the metro growth is not exclusive to just the county where the big city is, and the growth is not exclusively to the benefit of one party or the other. And I think a lot of times people lose track of that. And I think a lot of the Democrats that you heard commenting before the census numbers came out, I think made the assumption that the metro areas are growing and therefore Raleigh is growing, or the metro area is growing and therefore Charlotte is growing, without thinking about it's the metro that's growing. So that means it's Union, Cabarrus, Iredell, Gaston, Mecklenburg County, and then Harnett, Wake, Johnston, Granville, Franklin County. The whole area is growing, and some of those counties are pretty Republican, and the urban core are pretty Democratic. And so in large measure, I think it kind of offset this year. I think independent redistricting committees suffer from a bias towards drawing districts to achieve a proportional outcome. And that oftentimes requires as dramatic a gerrymander as a Republican or Democratic majority trying to really rig a map to help themselves. So I've always been a proponent of what you see in North Carolina, which is basically a formulaic draw that makes a determination about what your key building block is going to be. And this is in North Carolina, it's counties. And so they've got a formulaic draw that puts those counties together. And I would argue that that is the single best way to stop the most egregious abuses you see that occur in a reapportionment and redistricting process, is that formulaic draw that requires counties, which by definition are at least political entities that have a common interest in a geographic, in a relatively concentrated geography, that those be put together. So I think that that the formulaic draw that is a product of the whole county provision of the North Carolina Constitution is probably one of the single most important anti-gerrymandering provisions that I'm aware of in state law, and I think it's probably far more effective than an independent redistricting commission. And I've often wondered why the people in North Carolina and the legislature in North Carolina hasn't chosen to adopt something similar for Congress, because I think it would really cut down on the accusations of gerrymandering that you've had and the litigation that you've seen in North Carolina over the years. I remember former Senator Andrew Brock, back in 2004 or 5, was one of the first years I worked at the legislature, actually had a constitutional amendment that adopted something similar to the whole county provision for congressional districts, but that stuff's never gotten legs.